Spring 1943. The air above the Ural Mountains was thick with smoke and iron. Deep inside the Soviet Union, far from the front lines, a young welder named Nikolai Simonov stood in the deafening roar of a tank factory that never slept. Outside, the Red Army was bleeding. Inside, another kind of war was being fought, one of machines, fire, and precision. Every day, hundreds of T-34 tanks rolled out from the plant, their steel hearts forged for the desperate defense of a nation on the edge. But something was wrong. Explosions, violent, unexplainable, were destroying tanks before they even reached the battlefield. Entire shipments lost dozens of workers killed, and the front was collapsing. The engineers were out of answers. The commanders demanded results. In the middle of this chaos stood a 19-year-old welder, exhausted, soot-covered, barely trained, who would uncover the flaw that no one else could see. What Nikolai found inside the steel hulls of those tanks would save over 1,000 machines and possibly the war itself. Factory in Nizhny Tagil was a place where time ceased to exist. It was the beating heart of Soviet armor production, churning out thousands of T-34 tanks under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The workers lived inside the thunder of molten steel and hammering rivets. Sleep came in shifts, meals were rationed, and the sound of air raid sirens often drowned beneath the clang of metal. The air burned with a scent of oil, carbon, and fear. Most of the men were gone, sent to the front, so the factory floor was filled with teenagers, widows, and old mechanics who refused to die in peace. Among them was Nikolai, a quiet boy from a small village who had once dreamed of becoming an engineer, but was drafted to weld armor instead. He was small for his age, but his hands were steady. In the tank core factory, that steadiness meant survival. The T-34 was the pride of the Soviet Union, a machine that symbolized resilience. But in 1943, its production had become rushed, desperate, sloppy. Reports began arriving from the front. Tanks catching fire without being hit. Crews trapped inside, burned alive before they could even see the enemy. Commanders blamed sabotage. Supervisors blamed the welders. The atmosphere turned poisonous. Every man and woman on the line worked under suspicion. Even a small mistake, a missed seam, a flawed joint, could cost not only lives, but one's own freedom. Nikolai noticed things others didn't, the sparks that burned differently on certain plates, the way the armor sometimes warped near the fuel compartments. He felt it in his hands. The steel wasn't cooling right. Something about the welds seemed alive, unstable, wrong. But when he spoke up, the foreman silenced him. "You're a boy, not an engineer," they said. "Keep welding." Yet the reports of explosions kept coming. Entire tank divisions were being held back for inspection. Rumors spread that German spies had infiltrated the plant. The NKVD began interrogations. People disappeared overnight. One morning, a tank detonated just after a routine test. The blast ripped through the assembly line. Nikolai was there. He saw men torn apart by shrapnel, steel doors twisted like paper. The explosion came from inside the tank, somewhere near the fuel reserve. Panic gripped the factory. The air was thick with dust, the ceiling lights flickering through smoke. For a moment, everything fell silent except for the ringing in his ears. And in that silence, Nikolai made a decision that would change everything. He would find the cause, no matter the risk. He began staying late after shifts, sneaking into the inspection area when no one was watching. He studied the wrecked hulls, running his fingers over the seams, the blackened metal, the half-melted bolts. He saw a pattern. Every explosion began near the same junction, where the main fuel line passed through the armor plate. The welds in that section looked perfect to the naked eye. But when he chipped away at the residue, he found tiny cracks, hairline fractures invisible under normal light. The fuel leaked through them slowly, soaking into the insulation, waiting for a single spark. A death trap disguised as perfect craftsmanship. He was terrified. If he was wrong, he'd be accused of sabotage himself. If he was right, then the entire assembly process had been flawed for months, and thousands of tanks could be at risk. The weight of that realization pressed down on him like the steel plates he welded. No one would believe a 19-year-old worker, but Nikolai had seen too much to turn away. He made notes, sketches, samples of the failed welds. His hands trembled as he hid them beneath his cot in the dormitory. Outside, trains loaded with tanks were leaving for the front. and he knew some of them were doomed. That night, as the factory lights dimmed and the sound of locomotives faded into the blackness of the Ural sky, Nikolai stood by the assembly floor, staring at the endless line of machines waiting to be born. Each one gleamed under the lamps, cold, beautiful, and deadly. He whispered to himself, "If I don't speak, they'll all burn." The next morning, the factory was louder than ever, steel screaming, furnaces roaring, men shouting through smoke. But inside Nikolai's chest, there was only silence. Every strike of the hammer echoed against his ribs. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. He waited until the midday break, when the floor supervisors gathered near the drafting room to review the next production batch. His palms were slick with sweat as he held his notes, crude sketches marked with soot and grease. When he stepped forward, no one noticed him at first. He had to raise his voice just to be heard over the machinery. "Comrade Foreman," he called out, "I think I know why the tanks are exploding." The room fell still. Dozens of faces turned toward him. Older men, engineers in gray coats, eyes heavy from sleepless nights. The foreman frowned, irritated. "You think?" he barked. "You're a welder, not a designer." But Nikolai didn't back down. He spread his papers across the table, his hands trembling. He showed the drawings, the fracture points, the residue he had scraped from the destroyed hulls. "It's not sabotage," he said quietly. "It's the welds. The steel is too hot when it meets the fuel casing. The heat makes micro cracks. The fuel leaks through, and when the engine starts," he hesitated, swallowing hard, "it ignites." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the laughter began, bitter, nervous laughter. "A boy thinks he's smarter than our engineers," one said. Another muttered, "Ridiculous. The TP-34 has been tested 1,000 times." But one man didn't laugh, the senior metallurgist, an old man named Petrov. He leaned in, squinting at the notes. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight. "Where did you see this?" he asked. Nikolai explained everything. The patterns, the tests, the residue. Petrov's silence was heavier than any shout. Before anything else could be said, two soldiers entered the room. NKVD. Their black uniforms cut through the smoke like blades. "Comrade Simonov," one of them said, voice flat, "you are to come with us." The room froze. Someone had reported him. Nikolai's heart dropped into his stomach. He barely had time to breathe before they dragged him from the floor, past the roaring furnaces, past the other welders who stared in terrified silence. He knew what this meant. Accusations of sabotage could end not just in prison, but in death. They took him to an office room on the second floor, cold and dimly lit. Papers covered the desk, a single lamp casting hard shadows across the walls. The officer questioning him was calm, deliberate, almost polite. "So," he said, "you claim our tanks are exploding because you found a mistake in the welds? And all our engineers missed it?" Nikolai nodded, barely able to speak. The officer smiled thinly. "Or maybe," he said, "you're trying to hide the fact that you made the mistake." The interrogation stretched for hours. Questions repeated, accusations twisted. His throat burned from thirst. Every answer seemed to make it worse. "You think we believe a boy from the countryside over trained specialists? Who told you to say this? What are you trying to hide?" He felt the walls closing in, the air turning thin. But through it all, Nikolai held on to one thought: the welds. He kept describing the same details, the heat, the cracks, the leak points, until even the officer grew tired of arguing. Finally, Petrov entered the room, carrying a small metal plate from one of the wrecked tanks. "Comrade," he said to the officer, "let him go. I've tested his theory." The officer looked up, skeptical. Petrov placed the sample on the desk. The metal glinted under the light. "He's right," Petrov said softly. "The fracture starts where the weld overlaps the fuel line housing. It's invisible to the naked eye, but under stress it opens. The moment fuel reaches the surface, it burns." The room fell silent. Nikolai felt his breath return, shaky but real. The officer studied him for a long time, then finally said, "You're lucky, Bo. You may have just saved the factory." By the time he returned to the floor, night had fallen. The other workers avoided his eyes, some out of fear, some out of shame. The foreman, now pale and shaken, ordered the entire assembly process halted. For the first time since the war began, the factory fell quiet. Engineers gathered around Nikolai's notes, testing his theory, checking the joints he had marked. The truth spread quickly. The young welder had been right. The flaw came from a change in the alloy composition, an unreported adjustment made to speed up production. Under heat and vibration, the welds failed. The next morning, the redesign was implemented across all production lines. Nikolai was assigned to a new team. Inspection. Every tank that left the factory now passed through his hands. Within weeks, the explosions stopped. Trains began rolling east again, their cargo safe, their crews alive. But even as praise quietly circled among the engineers, Nikolai felt none of it. He had seen what almost happened, the deaths, the silence, the price of rushing perfection. The victory was heavy. That night he walked alone through the empty corridors, the echo of his boots the only sound. He paused before one of the finished tanks, its steel surface reflecting the pale factory lights. He placed his hand on it, the same hand that had once trembled under fear, and whispered, "Now they'll come home." He was 19, and though history would never record his name in medals or monuments, the machines that thundered across the Eastern Front carried the mark of his courage, an invisible signature in every weld, every seam, every life saved. Winter arrived like a hammer. The Ural winds cut through the factory walls, carrying the taste of frost and iron. Production never stopped, not even for a moment. Every tank that left the assembly line bore the silent mark of change. The new welds, the corrected seams, the invisible work of a boy who refused to be silent. Nikolai rarely spoke of what happened. His name was not mentioned in reports, his story buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. But deep inside, he felt something shift. He was no longer just a worker shaping steel, he was shaping fate. The months passed, and the sound of war crept closer. The Red Army began to push westward. Kursk, Ural, Kharkov, names whispered on the factory floor like prayers. Then one morning, a battered train arrived from the front. On its flat cars lay tanks, scarred but alive. Their crews stepped off in soot-streaked uniforms, exhausted but grinning. "They held," one soldier said. "The new ones, they don't burn anymore." Those words spread through the plant like sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in years, there was laughter, quiet, cautious laughter. When Nikolai heard it, he couldn't move. He stood beside the doorway of the workshop, his gloves black with soot, and let the sound wash over him. They didn't know who he was. They didn't need to. It was enough to know that somewhere, far beyond the smoke and the rail lines, men had lived because of what he'd done still. A strange heaviness lingered inside him. He had seen how easily truth could be buried, how close disaster had come. The victory felt fragile, like glass beneath a boot. A few weeks later, Petrov, the old metallurgist, called him into his office. On the desk lay a stack of papers, stamped and sealed. "These are your transfer orders," Petrov said. "The Army needs inspectors at the front. They want someone who understands the welds." Nikolai stared at him, stunned. The front. The thought filled him with both pride and terror. He had saved tanks with his mind. Now he was being asked to watch them burn for real. Days later, he arrived at a repair depot near Belgorod. The battlefield stretched beyond the horizon, a wasteland of frozen mud and wreckage. The ground trembled with distant artillery. Columns of smoke twisted into the gray sky like ghosts. Everywhere he looked, there were tanks, damaged, half-buried, their armor scarred by shells and fire. Nikolai worked alongside soldiers and mechanics, inspecting each machine that rolled in from the fight. The air was thick with oil and cordite, and at night he could hear the low hum of engines and the quiet sobs of men who had lost comrades hours earlier. He found his answer to what courage really meant. Not in the shouting, not in the glory, but in the silence between battles. He watched as crews climbed into their repaired tanks, faces hard but eyes uncertain. He remembered the reports from the year before. Crews who had died trapped inside, their tanks exploding from within. But now they rolled out again, their engines roaring steady, their armor unbroken. Nikolai would stand in the snow, his breath a white cloud, watching the black silhouettes disappear into the smoke. He never told them who he was. He didn't need to. One night, a lieutenant approached him, his uniform torn, his hands shaking from the cold. He handed Nikolai a small metal piece, part of a weld from a tank that had survived direct fire. "Whoever fixed this," the officer said, "saved my crew." We took a shell to the side and it held. The weld held. He didn't know the boy standing before him was the reason. Nikolai just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. When the officer left, he turned the fragment over in his hand. The weld line glimmered faintly in the firelight. Smooth, strong, perfect. The war raged on. The tanks Nikolai had inspected rolled into Kursk, where the largest armored battle in history erupted. Reports came back, thousands of German panzers destroyed, the Soviet lines unbroken. The T-34s, his T-34s, had withstood the inferno. Each machine that survived carried with it the invisible proof of his work. It was not a medal, not a name carved into stone, but it was something greater. It was survival. When the depot finally fell silent after the victory, Nikolai sat outside among the wrecks, watching the sunrise paint the snow with blood-red light. His hands, calloused and blackened from years of welding, trembled slightly as he held them near the flame of a small campfire. He thought of home, of the factory, of the men who had once mocked him, and the others who had vanished into the smoke of war. He realized that courage was not just facing death, it was facing indifference. The moment when the world turns away and still choosing to act, the wind howled across the frozen plains, carrying the echo of engines. Somewhere out there, the tanks were still moving. And in that distant thunder, Nikolai heard something like a heartbeat. Not just steel, not just fire, but life. The war dragged on into 1944, grinding across the ruins of Europe like a machine that fed on flesh and faith. By now, Nikolai Simonov was no longer the trembling boy who had stood before the foreman's desk. The soot still clung to him, but his eyes had changed, older, quieter, touched by something beyond exhaustion. He had inspected hundreds of tanks, welded thousands of seams, and watched more than enough men disappear into the smoke to know that victory came at a terrible cost. The factory back in Nizhny Tagil never slept. Every day, the telegrams came. Names of fallen workers, sons, brothers, fathers. The walls were plastered with photographs, most already faded by the grime of war. When Nikolai returned there briefly to oversee new improvements to the armor plating, he walked those same corridors and felt a hollow ache where the noise used to live. The laughter that had once filled the welding bays was gone, replaced by silence and ghosts. Those who remained worked like shadows, their faces blank, their hands automatic. One evening, as he inspected a new batch of hulls, Nikolai found a young woman, barely 16, struggling to hold a welding torch steady. The flame sputtered dangerously close to the fuel line joint. He grabbed her wrist gently, guiding it away. "Careful," he said softly. "The heat here can kill." She nodded, trembling. He saw himself in her, small, afraid, unnoticed by the men around her. That night, he sat alone by the furnace, the heat stinging his eyes, and wondered how many others like him had tried to speak, to fix, to save, and were never heard. Petrov, now stooped and coughing, found him there. The old metallurgist's voice had grown thin, his hands unsteady. "You did well, Kolya," he said, using the boy's name the way a father might. "But don't forget, steel remembers. Every weld carries its story." Nikolai looked at the glowing crucibles, the sparks bursting like stars. "And what story will mine tell?" he asked. Petrov smiled faintly. "That even a boy can change the course of a war." Then he coughed again, the sound harsh and final, and added, "But the world rarely remembers who held the torch." Weeks later, Petrov was gone. The news spread quietly. There was no ceremony, just another name on the wall, another space left empty in the factory's endless rhythm. Nikolai took over his post unofficially, training others in the new techniques, inspecting every line of armor with a precision that bordered on obsession. He refused to let even a single flaw slip through. Sometimes he would stop mid-weld, close his eyes, and remember the faces of the men who had died in those early explosions. The ones his discovery came too late to save. Each spark from his torch felt like a promise to them. Never again. As spring approached, the war began to shift. The Red Army was pushing west, liberating cities one by one. Rumors whispered that Berlin itself was within reach. The workers cheered, but Nikolai did not. He knew that the closer victory came, the more dangerous the work became. The pressure to deliver faster, stronger, more, never stopped. The same shortcuts that once caused disaster began to reappear, hidden behind the illusion of triumph. He found himself arguing with supervisors again, fighting to hold the line. "We can't cut corners," he warned. "Not now, not when we're this close." But they were tired, desperate to see the end. Then one morning, a blast shook the eastern section of the plant. Not as massive as before, but enough to send smoke curling into the sky in panic through the ranks. A faulty batch of armor plates had buckled under stress. No one died, but Nikolai stood amid the wreckage, his heart pounding as he stared at the twisted metal. It was a reminder the war wasn't just out there. It was here in the heat, in the pressure, in the choices men made when no one was watching. That night, unable to sleep, he walked to the rail yard where finished tanks waited for transport. Their steel hulls glimmered under the moonlight, silent and waiting, like a regiment of sleeping beasts. He climbed onto one, ran his hand over the smooth surface, and felt the faint vibration of its power. Cold, immense, alive. In that stillness, he realized something that chilled him more than any winter wind. The same courage that saves can also destroy, if it forgets its purpose. Nikolai began keeping a journal, not for glory, not for history, but for truth. He wrote about the flaw, the fire, the accusations, the faces of those who worked beside him. He described what it felt like to live surrounded by steel and fear, to hold death in your hands and shape it into protection. His words were simple, unpolished, filled with smudges of oil and soot. "Steel," he wrote one night, "does not forgive haste, neither does life." When the war finally began to wane and the world prepared to celebrate victory, Nikolai stayed at his post. No parades, no medals. Just the steady hum of the machines, the hiss of the torch, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his work had endured. Somewhere out there, across the scarred fields of Europe, his tanks were still moving, carrying men who would see another sunrise because one boy had refused to stay silent. He didn't call himself a hero. Heroes were men who fought with rifles and medals. Nikolai fought with silence, patience, and the steady rhythm of his breath as he welded the seams of history together, one spark at a time. The war ended in the spring of 1945. Bells rang across the Soviet Union. Crowds poured into the streets, weeping, singing, holding one another beneath banners of victory. The world exhaled after 6 years of suffocating fear. But in Nizhny Tagil, the factories did not fall silent. They simply changed rhythm, from war to peace, from urgency to exhaustion. The smell of oil still clung to the air. The clang of metal still echoed through the vast halls. And among the thousands of workers returning from the front or never having left it, few noticed the quiet man who now walked with a slight limp, a welding mask hanging loosely from his hand. Nikolai Simonov was 21. His hair was already touched with gray from the heat and stress. His body bore the burns of years spent too close to flame, and his eyes carried that faraway look shared by those who had seen too much too soon. He returned to his post as if nothing had changed, but the silence around him was different now, heavier, almost sacred. The walls that had once trembled with urgency now hummed with memory. One morning, a government official came to the plant to deliver medals and commendations. The foremen stood in neat lines, their uniforms pressed, their faces composed. Names were called out: engineers, designers, officers, men who had led, organized, and commanded. Nikolai's name was never mentioned. He stood at the back, his hands folded, the faint scent of smoke still clinging to his clothes. When the ceremony ended, he turned and went back to work. He didn't mind. The recognition he sought wasn't written in paper or pinned in metal. It was already carved into every tank that had survived because he refused to remain silent. Still at night, the memories came. The faces of those who died in the explosions. The interrogator's cold eyes. Petrov's final cough. The echo of the girl's trembling hands on the welding torch. Sometimes he would wake drenched in sweat, the phantom roar of an explosion still ringing in his ears. He would sit at the edge of his bunk, light a cigarette, and stare at his calloused palms, the same hands that had once held both fear and salvation. "I only fixed what was broken," he would whisper to himself. "That's all." Years passed, the world moved on. The T-34 became legend, its victories carved into history books and parades. New tanks were built. New wars began. The names of the engineers were celebrated, written in gold on plaques. But Nikolai's notebooks, smudged, worn, filled with the handwriting of a young man who refused to look away, sat in a drawer, untouched, their pages slowly fading. Only a few who had worked beside him remembered. "There was a boy," they would say quietly, "who found a flaw that saved us all." In the 1960s, long after the war, a historian from Moscow visited the factory to write about Soviet tank production. He came across a rumor, an unnamed welder who had discovered a fatal flaw. He searched records, questioned survivors, sifted through paperwork. But there was no mention of Nikolai Simonov in the archives. His name had been buried under layers of bureaucracy, erased by time and pride. The historian left frustrated, convinced the story was myth. Nikolai never corrected him. By then he was an old man, his lungs scarred by years of breathing in fumes and flame. He spent his final days teaching apprentices how to listen to metal, the faint changes in pitch, the whispers of strain that told you when steel was ready to bend or about to break. "Metal speaks," he would say, "but you have to be quiet enough to hear it." His students didn't know that he was speaking from a lifetime of silence. When he died, there was no ceremony, just the hiss of the furnace, the steady hum of the factory continuing without pause. His belongings were packed into a small box, a pair of gloves, a rusted torch, and a journal stained with soot. In it, one line stood out, written in faint pencil strokes. "Strength is not in the steel we forge, but in the truth we refuse to ignore." Years later, when historians finally unearthed records of unexplained factory explosions in 1943, one name appeared briefly in a forgotten report. Comrade N. Simonov, welder, assistance noted in resolving structural defect. A single line in a mountain of documents, that was all history gave him. But that single line carried the weight of thousands of lives. The tanks he helped save became symbols of resistance, of survival, of courage under impossible pressure. And though no one saw it, every time a T-34 rolled through the snow, its armor gleaming beneath the sun, it bore within it the spirit of a boy who had once stood alone in a room full of fear and chosen to speak. Courage is not always a shout. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that refuses to be silenced when everything around it demands obedience. Nikolai Simonov was no general, no commander, no decorated hero. He was a welder, a boy with steady hands and a stubborn belief that truth mattered more than rank. In a world that rewarded silence, he chose to speak. In a time that crushed individuals beneath machinery and fear, he chose precision, honesty, and care. His story reminds us that history is not made only by those who fight on the front lines, but also by those who stand in the shadows, by the ones who see what others overlook, who mend the cracks before they destroy everything. It teaches us that greatness often hides behind dirt-streaked faces, trembling hands, and sleepless eyes. Decades passed, the foundries that once thundered with the sounds of war slowly faded into rust and silence. The tanks that Nikolai Simonov helped build were retired, displayed in museums, or left to weather in the open fields where grass grew through their tracks. The world moved forward, faster than anyone could have imagined. New wars, new machines, new generations who had never felt the sting of hot steel or the terror of an air raid siren. Yet beneath the dust of history, the fire Nikolai lit never truly went out. In the late 1980s, long after his death, a group of young engineers restoring an old T-34 at a military museum in Ekaterinburg came across something unusual. On the underside of a fuel line casing, hidden beneath a layer of protective paint, was a single marking, barely visible. It wasn't a serial number or a factory code. It was a name, etched with the careful hand of a welder's tool, N. Simonov. The mark was small, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But when they saw it, they understood someone long ago had left his name not for recognition, but as a quiet promise. A promise that even in the chaos of war, precision mattered. Truth mattered. Life mattered. The engineers restored the tank with reverence. They left the name untouched. And when it was finally unveiled for the public, standing proud under the glass dome of the museum, they told the story, not the official one written in archives, but the whispered legend passed down by old workers and mechanics. The boy who saved 1,000 tanks, the welder who defied silence, the one who saw what others could not. Visitors came and went. Children pressed their hands against the cool metal. Veterans stared at it in silence, their reflections rippling across the armor like ghosts revisiting the past. Few knew the full story. Most never would. But some, those who listened closely, felt something deeper beneath the surface. A hum, a presence, the lingering heartbeat of a machine born not just from steel, but from courage. And in that heartbeat lived Nikolai's legacy, not as a name in a book, but as a lesson carried forward through time. Every young engineer who looked at that tank and asked, why was unknowingly following in his footsteps? Every worker who refused to cut corners, who demanded safety, who spoke up when something felt wrong, they were carrying his flame. History often remembers wars by their victories, their generals, their banners. But the true victories, the quiet ones, belong to the people no one sees, to the welders, the machinists, the thinkers, and the stubborn souls who believed that one act of integrity could stand against an empire of fear. Nikolai Simonov never lived to see the world he helped save. He never knew that his story would survive the silence of the archives. But perhaps that's fitting. Because the kind of hero he was, the real kind, doesn't fight for memory. He fights for meaning. And if you listen closely, in the hush of a factory at dusk or the echo of a hammer striking steel, you can still hear his story, the rhythm of sparks falling like rain, the sound of truth being welded, seam by seam, into the armor of a fragile world.